So welcome to everybody. Welcome to the third and final session of this year's online conference from the British Society for the History of Pharmacy. If we could start with a little bit of housekeeping, while the speakers are speaking, if you could mute yourselves and turn off your cameras, that would be greatly appreciated. We are also live streaming on YouTube, and if your cameras are on, it means you can be seen on the YouTube stream. And it also obviously helps with your own connectivity as well. If you haven't met me before, my name's Bryony Hudson, and I'm the conference organizer for BSHP and also run the social media channels for the Society. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this session. As you all know, this afternoon we're exploring pharmacy's global history. Just two more housekeeping announcements, which are that if you would find subtitles useful, at the bottom of your screen or wherever you've got your Zoom buttons, there should be one that says CC for closed captions. So if you click on that, you can toggle the subtitles on and off. And the other point to make is that if you find the chat, please do use that as the speakers are speaking to come up with any reactions, to put any questions you'd like me to put to them at the end of their talks. So anything that occurs to you, please feel free to use that chat function. And similarly, if you're watching on YouTube, then if you want to comment, then Chris is watching on YouTube and can pass any questions over to the speakers here on Zoom. We have, for the programme, a short amount of time that we may be able to put specific questions to each set of speakers, but a longer discussion session programmed at the end, which means that we can wrap up any other questions and also have a more general discussion about the themes that have been raised. So I think that's all of the housekeeping and the introductory business done, and therefore it's my great pleasure to welcome Mark Nesbitt and Kim Walker to give our first talk. Mark is the curator of the Economic Botany collection at Kew and a visiting professor at Royal Holloway, and he, for the purposes of this society, is our deputy president. And Kim works with Mark at Kew, where she's carrying out her PhD research on cinchona in the Kew collection. So they're perfectly placed to give us this first talk, just the tonic, quinine cures and cocktails. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bryony. I will now share my screen. There we go. It's doing its stuff. Oh, there we go. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to the British Society for the History of Pharmacy for the opportunity to talk about this, postponed by a year, but the subject of cinchona and quinine never goes out of date. So this is a book talk, so I'd like to start by introducing a little bit about the history of the book. I'm also going to introduce you to the cinchona tree, then hand over halfway through to Kim to talk more about its use in medicine and in refreshment. So why did we write the book? It was at the instigation of Kew Publishing, and really with two drivers. One is that, as you may have well noticed in your local bookshop when you could get there, but there are perhaps 30 or 40 books on gin out and about, riding on the back of the artisan gin trend. And each of those 30 or 40 books on gin tells a different story, often a contradictory story about the history of tonic water. So we felt there was something that, given the botanical origins of tonic water, there was something there that deserved investigation. But the other was our desire to take a really burgeoning literature in the history of medicine and the history of empire. So we're thinking here of really quite recent books. Some came out after ours. So by Matthew Crawford on the origins and export of cinchona from Latin America, three wonderful books by Rohan de Broy, Stephanie Gaines, just come out, and a classic by Mark Honigsbaum on the dispersal of the cinchona tree and quinine as a medicine around the world. And we thought there was an opportunity to experiment with taking what are can be quite heavy subjects. Malaria remains a really serious illness, and which is very closely tied to the history of empire, and connect it to the social history of tonic water, and see if we can make something that was digestible and enjoyable, but didn't shy away from perhaps more difficult aspects of these histories. One reason we felt able to do that was by the wealth of cinchona researchers in and around us, sometimes at Kew, sometimes at institutions in Scandinavia and in Latin America. So Carla Maldonado, who did her PhD in cinchona in Copenhagen, created the National Herbarium in Bolivia. A team here that includes Nina Ronstedt, who developed a lot of this work in Copenhagen, Alex Antonelli, who's Gothenburg, but now head of science at Kew, did his PhD on cinchona. Esther, the archivist at the Royal Botanic Garden in Madrid, Natalie Canales, a PhD student in Copenhagen and Kew, working on genetics and chemistry of these historic cinchona specimens. Kim, seen here with a student from Royal Holloway, where she's a PhD student, digitizing cinchona specimens, and Oscar Perez, a colleague at Kew who's working on the genome and genomics of cinchona. So there's a moment, if you like, for cinchona, and an opportunity to perhaps do what hasn't really been done perhaps since the 19th century, which is to bring the science and the humanities together to tackle this big subject. So brief introduction to the tree, around about 25 to 30 species, new ones still being discovered, growing down the eastern slopes of the Andes here, an area that for any botanist, wherever you are, is difficult to access, very high, very rugged landscapes, as you can see in the photograph behind. Really attractive lilac-scented flowers you can buy from Trumpers Barber here in London, a quinine perfume, which is of course not the quinine molecules, it's the flower scent. And there is a question about the history and origins, the discovery of the use of cinchona. We often like to project these things back into the past, and many medicinal plants undoubtedly have millennia-long histories of use. Cinchona may or may not be one of those. The first absolutely certain reference to it by a Jesuit priest, Antonio de Calancha, 1633, describes a tree which they call a fever tree in the land of Loa, whose bark of the color of cinnamon made into powder and given as a beverage at the weight of 2 reals cures the fevers and tertians, so crucially the cyclical fevers. This is the identifier of malaria from so many other fevers. It has produced miraculous results in Lima. And Matthew Crawford and others have now identified a couple of earlier references in the late 16th century, which may also refer to cinchona. But there is a problem, and the first problem is about time. But malaria is largely absent from Latin America before the Spanish conquest. So what was cinchona used to treat before then? And the other is space. But the illness was most prevalent on the coast in cities indeed such as Lima on the coast of Peru up until the 19th century, and railways carried it up into upland areas. Yet cinchona trees typically grow from 1,000 meters upwards. So the harvesters and the indigenous knowledge are in one place, high, and the people suffering from malaria in another place that's low. The story is still unclear. The answers might lie in archives in Lima or in Madrid, but Matthew Crawford and other Peruvian historians would point perhaps to the Loja region here in southern Ecuador, just north of Peru, as perhaps the area where the earliest exports are documented, a strong tradition of indigenous healers, and not too far away from the major exporting ports. Perhaps this is where cinchona's use was first discovered. A brief introduction to the all-important molecules of the 4 quinine alkaloids. This is the common factor between the refreshing tonic water and the curative quinine. So here we have the checked bark of the cinchona tree. containing the quinine alkaloids, varicose to protect the tree against predators, a reminder that quinine alkaloids are poisonous, and then with extraction from 1820 onwards, but the use of pure quinine either as a medicine or as the key defining ingredient in tonic water. And that demand for medicine in Europe was, of course, driven by the prevalence of malaria, just taking Britain as a case study, in those easterly areas around the Wash and along the Thames estuary, not eliminated until the First World War, and it became really imperative to do so. And then, of course, the drive for consumption beyond Europe into the tropics in the 19th century, that led to the contested transfer of cinchona from the eastern states of the Andes to India, and then its marketing within India, both for colonial occupying forces, but also its spread into villages. What I'm now going to do is to hand over to Kim, who's going to talk more about those medicinal uses. I'm going to unshare my screen. I'm going to invite you to turn up your sound a little bit because Kim's recording is a little bit quieter. You don't need to turn it all the way up to 11, but give it a little turn upwards and be prepared to turn it up more as well. And we'll hand over to a recording of Kim, who will be joining us for the discussion, but it is a slightly Wi-Fi free zone for presenting a talk. And here we go.
Evolution of use of cinchona after it came to Europe and then beyond to the colonies. I will briefly show some key texts in its medicinal categorization, its uses, and by the end hopefully show you how it turns into the ultimate gin and tonic. So from bark to jar to bottle, as the picture shows. Now I'd like you to just throw your mind back to that 1633 reference that Mark mentioned from Father Calancha stationed in Peru. Cinchona was clearly in popular use by this time, and importation to Spain happens pretty quickly afterwards. And after that, it then starts to be adopted around Europe and enters Britain regularly by the 1850s. Like many popular herbal remedies, even today, cinchona's use was around long before it was adopted officially into medical texts. So it was around 20 or 30 years after its regular importation into Britain that the Royal College of Physicians recorded it into its Pharmacopoeia Londinensis in 1677, which says in the 1685 version, the Peruvian bark, of which the Jesuits' powder is made, is an excellent thing against all sorts of agues or malarial fevers, of which the learned Boyle has given ample testimony. So it was accepted by physicians as being excellent for ague if you could get good enough quality bark, but it had other challenges to face before being accepted by the public, which I'll now explain. Though early suspicion around its effectiveness was to do with a combination of factors including misidentification, adulteration, and unclear dosage, another influence was that as a Catholic drug being imported by Spanish Jesuits led to a certain amount of suspicion amongst the English, which is exemplified by Oliver Cromwell, who refused the popish powder before he subsequently died of malaria in 1658. Cinchona bark's acceptance, though, came around the time of Robert Talbot, a Cambridgeshire physician who moved to the Essex Fens to specialise in fever. He developed a secret remedy which he promoted at the same time as cunningly criticising the use of Peruvian bark. He went on to treat King Charles II and King Louis XIV with this secret remedy in the 1670s. His remarkable cure was so effective that King Louis wanted access to the secret recipe, and Talbot agreed on condition it would not be revealed until after his death. Sadly, this came not long after. Talbot returned to England in 1681 and died the same year. King Louis had the book translated to the people, and you can see a front page of the English translation here. And I will read the recipe for you. It says, take a pound of the best bark of cinchona, which is about 500 grams, beaten to a subtle powder, but sprinkle it interchangeably for the space of a day or two with a decoction of anise and the juice of parsley. Then put the powder into an earthen pitcher, holding about 15 or 16 quarts, about 2 litres, and pour upon it gently, still stirring the matter, as much good claret wine as the vessel will hold, and having afterwards stopped it well, lay in mixture infused for the space of 8 days. So the anise and parsley help cover the intensely bitter taste of cinchona, and I've tried making a version of this and it is remarkably tasty. He also adds opium in another step, which would have also helped the medicine go down and soothe the fractious patient. But it's the alcohol of interest in this recipe. Quinine alkaloids are well dissolved in alcohol, which helps the effectiveness of the remedy, and it also makes it pleasant to take. Other references across the 17th and 18th century show it being similarly used to talba, powdered and decocted or mixed with alcohol. So now I'm going to skip forward to the 19th century to look at how this period of time evolved its use in ways beyond fever. So here we have an extract from Jonathan Pereira's Elements of Materia Medica in 1857, which was a widely used compendium of drugs and their uses. In it, he talks about one of the medical categories that cinchona bark was valued for by the time, as a tonic, and this extract explains. None of the effects now enumerated included those to which the term tonic is properly applicable. These are to be sought for in patients suffering from debility without symptoms of local irritation. In such, we find cinchona improve the appetite, promotes the digestive functions, and increases the strength of the pulse, and so on about how it improves general health. This term tonic, which should be ringing bells, is an important category throughout the history of medicine for a treatment which generally improves tone or health. Often bitter flavours were tonics. Note this use is separate to its anti-malarial properties, but I'd like you to keep in mind its particular application for promoting digestion in a couple of slides. So, I mentioned before how cinchona bark was frequently prescribed in alcohol as a solvent and for taste. And by the 19th century, many proprietary medicines arose, combining quinine with alcohols, such as orange quinine wine, which sounds really delicious on the left there, and then in the centre, quina rossi and San Rafael, which you may recognise as still being around today. As a category, these blur the boundaries of drinking for health and for pleasure, sometimes for preventative nips, sometimes used in a bar setting. But quinine itself, as a medicine, is also still dispensed in spirits to tempt reluctant soldiers stationed in tropical areas to take the quinine in particular. But unlike most legends found in gin books, gin wasn't the preferred method. Usually it was what was handy at the time, so that might have been a whiskey or rum ration, but also included locally available spirits such as sugarcane arrack, which is seen here being dispensed from a roadside shop in India. And it is in India to which we can be thankful for the evolution of the G&T, though not for the dispensation of quinine doses. Many modern popular accounts also say that soldiers took their quinine preventative of gin to make it palatable. We challenge that account because daily doses didn't come in until the adoption of quinine as a prophylactic around the mid-1850s, which is pretty similar to the time of tonic water invention. So I will explain how the gin and tonic did come about, but let's quickly have a look at that tonic water first. So the first reference to tonic water that we discovered was from the Bristol Mercury in 1835, but it's called quinine soda water, and it comes from Hughes and Company. But it doesn't seem to become popular and quickly disappears off the market. But the first tonic water using that terminology, however, was patented in 1858 by Erasmus Bond of Islington, not India, but it was a British invention. It contained 5/8 of a grain, which is around 37.5 milligrams of quinine per bottle. It also included sulfuric acid to help dissolve it into the soda water. It's a tiny amount of quinine, and similar to levels found in tonic water today, but it's still intensely bitter, showing how strong quinine is. But do you remember me asking you to remember about Pereira's recommendation for its use as a digestive? This is what Hughes and Bond in these adverts are promoting it for, as an aid to digestion and as a general tonic. It does not have anything to do with fevers or malaria. So tonic water doesn't take off in a big way in Britain, though it does have its moment with the temperance crowd. but instead, as a refreshing thirst quencher, it becomes much more of a hit in tropical colonies, such as India, where cooling beverages such as this were promoted to help Europeans acclimatise to the tropical heat. So the first known reference to gin and tonic comes just about 10 years after tonic water itself is invented, and about 5 years after it becomes popular in India. It can be found in the Oriental Sporting Magazine in 1868, where the reference is in the context of a sporting party and says, "There was plenty of betting, and our modest fiver went on Polly, more for the sake of backing her rider than thinking of what class she was. Loud cries of gin and tonic, brandy and soda, cheroots, etc., told us that the party was breaking up for the night, and we wended our way home. It's clear that it's tonic being used here, but not medicinal quinine crystals with gin. So there's no fever or malaria, just high times and sports." And this is often where most gin and tonic references arise, by wealthy, upper class, sport or military inclined protagonists enjoying their peg. And the bitter tonic properties of this cocktail are why people have a pre-dinner gin and tonic today, as a digestive, influenced by the history we've just talked about. You just didn't realise. So to end, I hope that when you next drink a gin and tonic, you remember the rich history behind the drink. We can only lightly cover parts of this story here, so if you'd like to know more, please do check out Just the Tonic from Kew Garden Shop. And while you're there, you might want to try out their new gin too. The profits from both go to support the research and conservation that Kew does. I'd also like to suggest you try the Monzi tonic, which is pictured in the middle. It contains extracts of cinchona bark. Unlike other tonic waters, which only contain quinine particles, this actually is an extract using the bark, so it has a brown colour and has a nice extra nuanced flavour. So if you want to see what that tastes like and feel like a 17th century apothecary, then I really recommend you try it out. So thank you very much for listening to this talk, and we'll be taking questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Kim and Mark. I hope everyone could hear that okay in the end. I know that Kim hopefully is still with us to answer questions. We've got a couple of minutes that we can answer any specific questions anyone has through the chat, but maybe I'll kick off. If either of you, I guess, can tell us a little bit, I know there's a lot to say, but a little bit about the cinchona that you actually hold at Kew that's inspired the research.
So Kim, you're the researcher, so over to you.
Yes, but Kew holds one of the largest collections of cinchona bark in the world. It is exactly the same. Well, there's two collections that are large. One that's based in the Netherlands, because the Dutch also collected cinchona bark, and Kew, and they're almost exactly the same size. But we at Kew have more bark from South America, and there's about 1,000 bark specimens, and there's about 1,000 herbarium specimens altogether. And yeah, that represents kind of how important it was to the British in their attempt to understand the tree, because it had very difficult botany, but how important it was for controlling malaria, because if you control malaria, which was a problem at home in Britain, we had malaria all the way till 1914, but also you can control imperial projects, because malaria was a threat to the health of soldiers and civilians in areas where they've colonized.
Great. Do you want to add anything, Mark? Or?
Well, I think it's just worth mentioning that there's a wealth of archival material, which particularly the role of Howard's and Sons and John Eliot Howard, who did a lot to crack, if you like, the connection between the botany and the chemistry of the different species. And I think the plus side is most of that is in London, and the minus side is scattered between numerous institutions, local archives, London Metropolitan Archives, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society has really important material, of course, as does Kew. And I think Kim has done a brilliant job both of tracking all of that down and working around the limitations of COVID, which have been such a frustration for any PhD student in the last year or so.
Absolutely. I think I first met Mark on the hunt for Howard's material at the Pharmaceutical Society when I was curator there, quite a long time ago now. We've got a question in the chat from Chris Duffin. He asks, how variable is the quinine content in different species of cinchona? And if it is highly variable, what was the significance to the individual species?
So maybe I'll have a go at that one. So it's a really good question, and it's actually the fundamental science question that's underlying all of those people I showed in the slides. So working in the science of cinchona, but it's a very fascinating case of chemical ecology, of understanding why plants invest so much energy in producing these secondary plant compounds, as they're called. And there are significant variations between species. There are also significant variations between habitats as well. And it's an unresolved question about the involvement of the environment. And part of the challenge is, of course, that the cinchona forests that remain in the Andes are a shadow of what was there in the 17th century, before lots of harvesting, most recently, of course, in the Second World War, when other quinine plantation sources dried up. So we know some very general patterns. We have quite a good understanding of the shift as each species of cinchona was nearly wiped out with its own alkaloid profile. You'd move on to another one. And we know that there are genetically distinct forms, such as that grown in Java, that are quite high in that case in the pure quinine alkaloid, for example. Understanding, mapping that, if you like, geographically and by habitat is very much the aim of all of those multiple people working on the project, the long-term answers to take those historic samples and recreate by science the forests as they were, as a model.
Great, thanks, Mark. No, I'm inspired by how interdisciplinary the research is going on at the moment. We've got a question from Kerry. Did the alcohol content of wine versus distilled alcohol make a difference in quinine available to the patient? Gosh, good question.
I think the answer is yes, it would have done. But the period of time that people are taking this, they wouldn't have necessarily been, there weren't really clinical trials about it. So people were just using their experience, physicians would have been using the experience for dispensing it to patients. So I think, it was quite popularly put in wine earlier on, whereas the spirits later on tended to be more like tonic wines, which weren't necessarily anti-malarial anyway. But yeah, I think it would have made a difference, but probably not too much of a difference to worry about. But yeah, probably somebody needs to test that.
Thanks, Kim. Valerie asks, is quinine found in any other part of the tree? So presumably meaning, is it just in the bark?
Yeah, it is in small quantities in other parts of the tree, but it's most concentrated in the bark. I think there were some trials by when it was cultivated, if when they were pruning trees, it was worth their while, it was worth the government's while also pruning trees and taking quinine out of the leaves, but it wasn't found to be concentrated enough. So while it is found, it's not at a level that's of interest. But yeah, the root bark it's the bark and the root bark. But the root bark then means digging up the tree, which means you then destroy the tree. And in plantations, you could keep harvesting the bark and the tree wouldn't die. Using certain techniques, you could keep the tree going each year and renewing that bark.
Okay, so it means then it's a sustainable crop in economic terms. Yeah, that makes sense. Any other questions? Yes, from Anita. Is quinine still in tonic water or has it been removed? Can we recommend it for gout, she asks.
Yeah, quinine is still in tonic water. It is still the main ingredient. Most places use quinine sourced from plantations in Java in Indonesia, where there's still a plantation, and on the west coast of Africa, in Democratic Republic of Congo. So for example, fever tree gets theirs from the Congo, whereas the Q tonic water comes from Indonesia. So yeah, it's still in there very much so. And like that Beaumondsey tonic I showed you earlier as well, that's also using the actual bark. And can you recommend it from a gout? I've never heard it used for that, and I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't possibly say.
It's worth adding, Kim, that quite a few people who have leg cramps do swear by tonic water. So always worth a try, I think. Consumed in moderation.
Yeah. It used to be quinine tonic water used to be, or quinine tablets and sometimes tonic water used to be recommended for cramps, but it was taken away because, you know, after prolonged use at high doses, it can cause some cardiovascular issues. So it's definitely a level between cure and kill. Well, not kill, but, you know, between good cure and something with side effects.
Sounds like the subtitle for your book. Yeah, everything in moderation. I've had a couple of comments to me saying people are feeling thirsty having heard you both speak. So if anyone wants to reach for gin and tonic in the comfort break rather than a cuppa, then we won't be judging at all. Seems very suitable and pharmaceutical. Just chance for any more questions through the chat before we move on. And if anything occurs to you while you're listening to the other speakers, we can of course come back to any specific questions for Kim and Mark in our discussion session at the end. Okay, well, I think everybody's done for the moment. So thank you ever so much, Kim and Mark, for great talks and kicking us off in style. So let's move on to the next talk on the programme, which is from Nick Wood. Nick, would you like to share your screen while I introduce you? Is Nick there? Yes, he is. Perfect. So Nicholas Wood is currently honorary curator at the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London and a past master apothecary at the Society. And he's also in a very small club of people that can be past master of the apothecaries, but also past president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. He's a long-term member of BSHP. And as we can see, he's going to talk to us today about the transatlantic trade of Thomas Mayleigh, Quaker apothecary. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, Bryony, and thank you for asking me to speak on this occasion. Yes, it is a very small club who have been both master of the apothecaries and president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. In fact, it's a club of one, so I'm rather lonely, looking for other people. However, thank you for speaking. This is all aboard the Prosperous Solomon, and I'm going to talk about the transatlantic trade of Thomas Mayleigh, because this is a story of Thomas Mayleigh, who was a Quaker apothecary of Gracechurch Street in London, and also a little about his father as well, who was similar. And it is about how it began with the donation in 2001 to the archives at the Society of Apothecaries of Mayleigh's account book, which had been preserved by the Richardson family in York. The investigations then that myself and colleagues made into Mayleigh's life and family and his connection, interestingly, with Sylvanus Bevan and the famous Plough Court pharmacy, and his trade across London and the Atlantic, was in fact reported in 2009 in my Gideon DeLorme lecture to the Society's Faculty of the History and Philosophy of Medicine and Pharmacy, which was called A Time of Transition. Physician or pharmacist. That was published in the Pharmaceutical Historian, and if anybody wants to refer back to it, then if you go to the BSHP website and look under publications and under the, you'll be directed to 2010, it's actually in volume number 2, or page 30 onwards. So I gave that talk then, back more than 10 years ago, but there was a subsequent talk which was Pharmacy in the Dawn of Empire. And this was not published, but presented to a seminar, again, organized by the Faculty for the History and Philosophy of Medicine and Pharmacy at Apothecaries Hall. But that rather indicated to me that the work was unfinished on Mayleigh's book. And so it prompted a re-examination by me of the work. This long re-examination has expanded and updated some of the earlier work. And I particularly wanted to analyse Mayleigh's trading partners listed in the book, and did so by means of an Excel spreadsheet, and went on to investigate some of the individuals more fully, because once you get all the entries onto an Excel spreadsheet, you can move them around and categorize them much more easily. But there's going to be a fuller version of the new findings, and that'll be published in Pharmaceutical Historian later this year. So the account book, and here it is with the first pages, it shows Mayleigh's business started in 1693, and it ends nearly 40 years later with his death in 1732. It also helps us to gain an insight into Mayleigh's father, who was also Thomas. He was a Quaker apothecary too, probably arrived in London from Wales in the spring of 1675. Now, Thomas Mayleigh Sr. had to apply to the court of the Society of Apothecaries that he had the experience and the skills of an apothecary, and he paid the significant charge or fine of £25, and that gave him a license to practice. And Mayleigh Sr. found a place to set up shop just outside the city in Wapping. Next door, it said, to the King's Head Tavern and close to the Hermitage Stairs, a little downstream from the Tower of London. Now, this is a slightly later map, but it does show the area, and I think you can see my pointer, of the Hermitage Dock and the Hermitage Stairs, which are now close to where Catherine's Dock is and London Dock. So that gives you an idea of where it was. Oh, dear, I'm sorry, my apologies. Let me. Next slide should be that one. Yes, that gives an idea of where it was, because this is a later picture taken where the Hermitage Dock once was, and it gives you an indication, as you can see from Tower Bridge, exactly where it is in relation to the city. So he set up shop, Mayleigh's father, and the Hermitage Stairs led down to the river. You can see that little inlet just in the middle of the picture where the Hermitage Stairs and the inlet to the dock was. And vessels would ply this area and bring their trade in from the new markets in America, bringing in sugar, cotton, coffee. But the trade in spices still arrived from the east, despite the rivalry with the Dutch. And Mayleigh Sr.'s apothecary shop would have been well placed for easy access to the new imported commodities, and as well to serve all the sailors and the traders who frequented that area of the docks. Now, we don't have any direct records of Mayleigh Sr.'s shop. The account books, which we have got, are the business records of the younger Thomas Mayleigh, the son. Now, he then went and set up his shop in Gracechurch Street in 1693. So he did an apprenticeship with his father, who was obviously well established in Wapping, and then young Thomas Mayleigh, whose account books we have, set up in Gracechurch Street in 1693. However, further examination has found that they contain entries in 1710, the year after his father's death, and they refer to the separate trade. And detailed examination of the account book provides evidence that the separate trade was in fact the apothecary's shop, run until 1708 by Mayleigh Sr. in Wapping. Now, Mayleigh Sr. didn't left any known will, but Thomas Mayleigh's accounts for 1710 record for the first time an additional £200 income from land at Pennsylvania, left by his father. And you'll see it written out here in an extract from the books. The same 1710 records show a varied group of entries from the separate trade, with a summary of all the medicines, utensils, and household goods purchased. And Mayleigh lists these debts and divers owings in the separate trade. So he's got the land at Pennsylvania, which you can see here, £200 coming in, and an estate at Longford as well. And then showing the debts in the separate trade that were left over from his father's business in 1710, he brings them into his own account book. So effectively, he's taking over his father's business. And amongst these separate trades of his father's business are a couple of things of interest. William Williams of Jamaica, you can see here, and Jonas Longford, both of whom were in the West Indies, with Longford being in Antigua. So it's highly likely that Mayleigh Sr.'s London Quaker connections prompted him to invest in land in William Penn's American Settlement Initiative. And here is William Penn, who was very much a Quaker leader. So the Pennsylvania settlement had been founded by Penn in 1682 with a grant of land from Charles II, and it was particularly taken up by the Quakers. Soon after the royal grant, Penn began sending off tracts of land to potential Quaker settlers, and the London congregations of Quakers, especially those associated with Gracechurch Street and its meeting house, they invested heavily. Thomas Mayleigh Sr., the one in Wapping, acquired his estate in 1685, and he got it from the executors of Robert Greenway. Now, Greenway had died that year, a little earlier, but he'd formerly been the master of the Welcome, which was Penn's ship that carried more than 100 Quaker colonists to Pennsylvania in 1682. So this Mayleigh estate in Pennsylvania was eventually quite considerable at 1,622 acres, almost the largest of the holdings in Bucks County, which you can see here. And I think you should be able to see that Bucks County is on the edge of Pennsylvania and New Jersey on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And there's some maps there which give a rough idea of where Mayleigh's estate was. So it's one of the three main Penn settlements there in Pennsylvania, and that's Bucks County. There's no evidence, however, that Thomas Mayleigh Sr. Ever farmed the land himself. So in all probability, that £200 income came from the rents of leasehold settlers and the lands passed down the generations, firstly to Thomas, his son, in Gracechurch Street, and then actually went to Thomas's daughter, Elizabeth, afterwards. So stayed in the family a long time. But returning to the younger Thomas Mayleigh, the Mayleigh of the account book, in 1695, Mayleigh records that some of his fledgling new business in Gracechurch Street is wholesale for sea. So I think you can see two sold in the wholesale way for sea. And so this seems to be the first of many mentions that he, as well as his father, was developing maritime and overseas connections. Now there's various gaps in the account books, but from 1712, there's details of a wide variety of Mayleigh's transactions, including rents, shipping, wholesale supplies, and household expenses. This is a typical page listing it out, and it's from these that I've extracted much of the detail. So what I did was go through that those books, finding the people, putting them all on a spreadsheet, and then letting the spreadsheet do the work of sorting them out and putting them in alphabetical order and so forth. So there's about 1,000 entries all told, and it's very easy then to pick out the ones that are for Antigua, as you can see, and of the sort of things that were sent. So as far as the transatlantic trade is concerned, the accounts known to be associated with customers in the West Indies and New England are listed in the next table, which is this one. So we've got a whole load of people who are in West Indies, Jamaica, Barbados, New Jersey, and also a number in the American mainland, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Maryland. Unfortunately, in the account books, there's rarely any detail as to the commodities that Mayleigh was trading, although sugar is known to be one. But there are other records available that throw a light on the sort of supplies that went backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. So, for example, this includes the letters of Joseph Cruttenden, and this is his books that were preserved, I think, at Oxford. Cruttenden was Mayleigh's exact contemporary, and they no doubt did know each other quite well because they were both associated with the apothecaries. Slightly later, there's the records of Joseph Gurney Bevan. That's the nephew of Sylvanus Bevan of the Plough Court Pharmacy. There's the records of Thomas Corbin and Co, and Pastor and Gort and others of Williamsburg. So we know that there are plenty of records of what commodities were being traded. So we now know as well that Mayleigh acquired some of his wholesale business from his father's separate trade. And we've got those two examples in the table here. It's in alphabetical order, so if you have a look, you should be able to find somewhere in the middle, Jonas Longford of Antigua, if you can read that okay. And that appeared in the accounts as a separate trade in 1710, and is mentioned in more than a dozen transactions right up to 1729. So Jonas Longford, or Langford, was maintained as a customer by father and son. Langford was a very substantial slave owner, had estates in Antigua, and Mayleigh sent him medicines on more than one occasion. Mayleigh also paid him over several £1000s over the years, and this may have been for the importation of produce, probably sugar, from Langford's Antigua estate. Later, Langford's grandson, also Jonas, obtained supplies from the Plough Court pharmacy, where Joseph Gurney Bevan, tongue twister there, berated him for being a slow payer. Similarly, William Williams, down towards the bottom of Jamaica, appears in the father's separate trade in 1710, but Mayleigh himself trades with him for at least another 10 years on his main account. In subsequent years, Mayleigh develops these and other trades with contacts in the Caribbean, as well as contacts in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in New England, as shown in this table. Many of those were plantation and slave owners. Joshua Crosby was a planter running 3 estates in Jamaica, while William Dorrell held nearly 3,000 acres in Westmoreland Parish, Jamaica, and had 450 slaves. Thomas Hall, a father and son, paid Mayleigh nearly £1,000 in regular transactions between 1716 and 1720. Although, since Hall is a fairly common name, it's not been possible to identify them definitively. Similarly, there were regular transactions in this period with the planter Thomas Woolery down there. Westmoreland Parish owned 152 slaves. So it's indicative of this nature of his transatlantic trade that many of the contacts were with significant Quaker families who were often related to each other. For example, Mayleigh carried on a substantial business for some 15 years with the Gale family. There's 4 entries here, including the brothers John and Isaac, who held 180 acres in St. Catherine's Parish in Jamaica. Isaac's son John, he had 300 acres in St. James's Parish. And supplies for the Gales included medicine and physic. Towards the end of his life, Mayleigh also supplied a grandson, Henry. Now, John and Isaac's sister, Mary, was married to a very large estate owner and merchant, Jonathan Dixon of Jamaica and Philadelphia. Mayleigh bought from Dickinson and supplied both his son Joseph and his brother Caleb with medicines when they were in London. In 1730, Joseph was charged £2, 1 shilling and a penny for physic, and so was probably in London and perhaps saw Mayleigh himself. And Mayleigh also may have acted as a banker for Caleb, because the £350 were paid over for a Scots bond. In turn, the Dickinsons were related to the Herring family of Jamaica in South Carolina. Nathaniel Herring, with lands in Westmoreland Parish and over 200 slaves, was a cousin of the above, and Mayleigh traded with several members of the family, including Oliver and Julines, an unusual name, but you can see Nathaniel Herring here on the slide, and then the 3rd entry is Julines Herring. And one curious and unresolved issue is that after Nathaniel's death, aged just 31 in 1716, Mayleigh received over £3,700 from his estate between the date of his death and 1720. The estate actually had devolved to Herring's sister, Bathsheba, but nevertheless, this sum amounted to over 1/3 of the total value of probate, and it's not known why Mayleigh was owed so much. Mayleigh traded with members also of the Vassal family of Jamaica, who were originally of Huguenot origin, and unusually, it's noted in the accounts that rhubarb had been supplied. The Witter family of St. Elizabeth Parish in Jamaica was a long-standing relationship with Mayleigh. Norwood Witter is listed in Mayleigh's accounts, although the fact that there was more than one Norwood Witter, must have been a family name that was carried on, it makes it tracing the correct one difficult. But certainly one of them was the 3rd of 4 husbands of Rosa Kelly, the owner of this place, Rose Hall, which still exists as a plantation house museum and is allegedly haunted by the ghost of the murderess Annie Palmer, the White Witch of Rose Hall. Now, I've actually been here to Rose Hall in the Caribbean, and it's a magnificent plantation manor. I've been and had a tour around, and while I was taken round, they take you into one of the rooms which they say that the ghost of Annie Palmer, the White Witch, haunts the room. And I must say, I went in there and it feels absolutely spooky. And it's one of these places that, you know, you feel you get cold spots in it. And I didn't like it at all. My wife laughed at me, because I'm not usually that sort of nervous or superstitious type. But certainly I felt the presence of the murderess Annie Palmer. In researching this talk a bit further, years later, I've discovered that apparently pretty much all of the story is apocryphal anyway. So what I was, what I was feeling, I have no idea. So there are some curious entries as well in the Witter account. Rosa Kelly took Witter as the third husband, in fact had a fourth. She inherited this rather grand estate from her first husband. But there's a curious entry in the Witter accounts, one of which is in 1728, and Mayleigh appears to pay out £2 to Witter for 5 weeks' board of a Negro. And I think you can make it out, quite small print on the extract from the account books, 5 weeks' board of a Negro. This is the only entry that has any possible allusion to slavery, although there are several payments about the same time to Witter's son, Oado, also for boarding. Quite what this implies, Oado would have been about 12 years old at the time, difficult to speculate on. So discounting this one enigmatic entry, there's no direct evidence to date that Mayleigh himself might have had a financial interest in Caribbean plantations or owned slaves, or was indeed involved in the slave trade. Daniels points out that a fringe debate amongst Quakers about the religious morality of slavery occurred in the late 1680s. In general, Quakers, in common with non-Quakers, saw nothing wrong with the institution of slavery, as long as St. Paul's doctrine that masters be just and fair to your slave, as long as that was followed. It was only after the mid-1750s, long after Mayleigh's death, that the Quaker movement against slavery began to gain momentum. However, as I say, apart from this one enigmatic entry, there's no indication at all that Mayleigh had anything significant to do with slavery. It was all his clients that did. So Mayleigh's clients across the Atlantic, however, were far from exclusively plantation owners and settlers. And the table that I showed you shows a number of medical and merchant transactions. One noteworthy one is that of Richard Poor of Barbados, shown here. He was a Quaker like Mayleigh. Poor's accounts have also survived and show him in receipt of the medicines sent by Mayleigh. So hence you've got a cross-reference, if you like. You've got Mayleigh's books with the £20 going out, coming, or theoretically coming in, and we also have Richard Poor's book, or Barbados, showing him owing £20 to Mayleigh. So that's a nice confirmation in both directions. Poor himself wasn't an apothecary. He was more of a general merchant of Barbadian produce, chiefly sugar. Mayleigh also supplied a few items to Poor's brother Benjamin, showing the family links amongst the Quakers, but also to his uncle Thomas. Now, Uncle Thomas was a non-Quaker, and he was able to hold a crown post, that of Marshal of the Court of Common Pleas in Jamaica, and Mayleigh dealt with him on 1 or 2 occasions. Another client was Morkadine Moore, and shown here, just Maud Moore. He was also a Quaker, but he'd been helped into an apprenticeship as a barber surgeon by meetings of the Society of the Friends in Wales. After qualifying as a barber surgeon, he immigrated to Pennsylvania in the 1680s and became a physician to Lord Baltimore. Mayleigh's accounts here show him supplying medicines to Moore from 1712 up until the year before Moore's death in 1721. The lower entry that you can see there is for Daniel Junifer, or probably Jennifer, and he was another Maryland surgeon like Morkadine Moore. Mayleigh's accounts show that the same amount of £28, 3 shillings and a penny, arriving as income in 3 successive years. But whether that was an identical order or the same balance shown but uncollected is unclear. Junifer is recorded as a surgeon of Charles County, and although he died quite young, only 34, he'd married in 1719, and his eldest son, Daniel of St. Thomas Junifer, was one of the founding fathers and a signatory to the United States Constitution. So not a Mayleigh customer, but he might have taken Mayleigh's medicines as a child. Mayleigh's accounts also show his involvement in funding journeys, for there are a number of entries of income and expenditure on named ships, notably the Neptune, the Mary, the Ashley. None of them have been identified with the slave trade, fortunately, but there's various other expenses such as the port duties on rum and wine. Mayleigh made profits on various voyages, and you can see here that they're listed. There's one to Barbados, I think. There were voyages to Carolina. Vera Cruz, you can see, so voyages to Carolina is marked there, £50. Voyage ditto to Vera Cruz and Jamaica. And in some cases, Mayleigh had a share in the ships. And in this particular case, this is where the Prosperous Solomon comes in, because Mayleigh had a share in it. We know this because in this final entry towards the end of the account books, this shows that this is cash paid to Mrs. Mayleigh after Mayleigh's death in full for 3/16 of the ship Prosperous Solomon. So ships are sold in portions that go anything up to, say, 1/64th. So 3/16 of a ship would be a normal share of a ship. So Mayleigh clearly had shares in the Prosperous Solomon. He's also, as you can see, got merchandise imported, and there's cash paid down below on account of the ship Winifred and Mary. So he's clearly making voyages, although we do not know if he ever actually went to the United States or across the Atlantic. He settled accounts for berthing, wharfage, insurance, and so forth, and supplied the medicines on ships such as the Mary and the Ashley. But there's no surviving port books in London for the period that Mayleigh was shipping, so we don't know exactly where they were trading to, but we're assuming across the Atlantic, and we certainly don't know if Mayleigh went on them at any time. The Lloyd Register, likewise, does not start until 1764, so it hasn't been possible to identify the individual voyages. So what can be said is that Mayleigh's wholesale and import business had a significant transatlantic element, and additionally that he ventured capital on the part ownership of the ships with which he transported his trade. And with his land in Pennsylvania, as well as his many Quaker trading partners, he was indeed, and his father was, he was indeed someone who had a very substantial transatlantic trade. So thank you very much indeed.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Nick. It's always a pleasure to see a detailed examination of one archival item. Really enjoyable. If anyone's got any questions, we've got time for one or two in the chat before we move to our comfort break. I wanted to ask Nick whether in the collections at Apothecaries Hall, whether you suspect there are other similar documents or account books from a similar period that might be ripe for a similar sort of investigation.
I don't think we have got anything that compares to this. We were very fortunate to be given the original of the Mayleigh book, and there's a facsimile as well in a museum in New York or near York, which the family donated to them. But I don't know of other things. One of the things about the Apothecaries Hall records, and there's 400 years worth of records, is that they're the administrative records of the hall. And people often ask us, what did you do about, what do you know about what apothecaries were selling? Well, very little, because we were dealing with the administrative part. We were qualifying them, overseeing their apprenticeships. Later on, we were examining them. And then we were dealing with our own things like exporting, because we had a sideline in laboratories, we were exporting drugs and medicines. So we are very fortunate to have the Mayleigh books, but there's nothing else really that compares a great deal. Although, as you've seen, for example, the letters of Thomas Crittenden, which are quite well known, indicate those sort of things. But I would love to find some more books. And just recently, I've come across an inventory, and I think you were associated with that from people in Nantwich who found an inventory of an apothecary shop, which shows what they've got. But there's nothing to compare with Mayleigh's account books, because there's 1,000 entries there, and many of the people can be traced.
A really rich source that you can keep ploughing into. Now, particularly, you've got it all systematized on your spreadsheet. So that
this is the part today is just about the transatlantic trade. The paper that's due to come out later on in the Pharmaceutical Historian talks a lot more about as well his properties and his trade in London.
Lovely. Great. Well, that brings us exactly to 5 o'clock. So that's absolutely perfect. And if anyone wants to ask Nick any other questions, we can, of course, do that in the discussion session later. Let's kick off then for the third and final talk of this session. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Sebastian Kroupa, who we've had a long wait for your talk, because you were awarded our Burnby Memorial Bursary for 2020, which you applied for in 2019. We invited you to speak at last year's conference in person, which of course we had to defer, we hoped, to this year in person. So it's lovely to welcome you virtually, but we hope to meet in person at some point. Seb, at the point he applied, was at Cambridge in the final stages of your PhD on the topic that you're drawing from today. Although since then, I believe you've moved on to King's College, where you're now in a postdoc post. But it's really lovely to finally have you here, and we look forward to hearing your talk. If you'd like to share your screen, over to you.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you for the introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for putting together such a great event, and to present and for the opportunity to present my work after all. And I am deeply honored and delighted to receive the Burnby Memorial Bursary, which, as we all know, bears the name of Juanita Burnby, from whom we have all learned so much about the history of British pharmacy. And I am sincerely grateful for this recognition, which really serves as the best possible motivation for my further work. Now, the paper that I am going to deliver today draws on one of the chapters from my PhD dissertation, which is broadly concerned with the communication of medical and natural knowledge between the Philippines and Europe, England especially, at the turn of the 18th century. Now, in my talk, I will focus on the medical practices of the Jesuit pharmacist Georg Joseph Kamel. In 1687, Kamel was sent as a missionary to the Philippines, which was then a colony under the Spanish flag. And during his stay, he produced treatises concerned with Philippine nature, in which he included episodes from his medical practice. And I will use one of these treatises, that of the medicinal plant locally called Igasur, as an example to illustrate how Kamel appropriated local materia medica into European systems of knowledge. By tracing Igasur's trajectory from a chance discovery to its introduction in European markets, I will show how a medicinal plant used by Filipino indigenous communities became a global commodity. I will argue that crucial to this outcome was the process of Galenization of Philippine materia medica. That is effectively their incorporation into the Galenic numeral framework, to which the Jesuits adhered both in their works and their training in pharmacy. By describing Igasur through the lens of Galenic theory, Kamel embedded the drug within European medical frameworks and facilitated its circulation on both local and global scales and markets. And indeed, in the 18th century, Igasur was successfully incorporated into the European pharmacopoeia, and I will briefly consider Kamel's role in this process. So Kamel was born in 1661 in Brno, in the present-day Czech Republic, where he was educated at the local Jesuit college. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1682 as a lay brother, before beginning his apprenticeship in pharmacy. He was trained in the Galenic tradition, and his understanding of medicine was therefore humoral. In 1687, he was listed among the Czech Jesuits selected for the Philippine mission. And upon his arrival in Manila, sometime between 1688 and 1699, Kamel added to the establishments of the local Jesuit college, the first Jesuit pharmacy in the Philippines. His workshop was located in the southernmost part of the Intramuros, or the Spanish-walled city. Kamel's fellow missionary, Pedro Murillo Velarde, described how the pharmacy held, quote, plenty of remedies for the common good, stored in flasks, jars, and fine earthenware from China and Japan, with various decorations and paintings. In colonial Manila, medical professional hierarchies and identities were less rigid than in Europe. And in addition to working as a pharmacist, Kamel also, quote, saved the college the salary paid to the physician, as he himself filled this position. Now, Kamel's duties led him to explore Philippine nature, the specimens of which he began to collect and document in order to identify resources which he could use in his medical practice. Promptly after his arrival, he established himself as a local colonial medical authority. The limited number of competitors in Manila acted in his favor. As he confessed to his compatriot Šimon Boruhradský, who was stationed in Mexico, there is no physician here but 4 friars who know little more than my pair of trousers. Kamel's reputation soon spread beyond the Philippine Islands, and by the late 1690s, he was engaged in a correspondence network which extended from Mexico across the Philippines all the way to England. And his involvement in this network enabled Kamel to deliver his reports of Philippine nature to London, where they appeared in print. Most of Kamel's descriptions of Philippine plants were published as an appendix to the 3rd volume of John May's Historia Plantarum, or the History of Plants, and the remainder of Kamel's treatises came out in the Philosophical Transactions. A few drawings were also printed in James Pettiver's periodicals, such as my favorite illustration, the flying cat monkey, which you can see here on the right. One of Kamel's treatises was concerned with the medicinal plant called igasur in Filipino indigenous languages. Modern botanists have identified igasur with Strychnos ignatii, a tree native to the Visayas Islands, which you can see circled here on this in this map, where its seeds had been used in healing prior to the European arrival. The eastern portion of the Visayas fell under the Jesuit jurisdiction, and it was probably here that they learned about the seeds' medicinal powers. Now, in order to appropriate igasur and impose their commercial trademark on the drug, the Jesuits renamed the seeds as the beans of Saint Ignatius, the founder of their order. However, adopting knowledge acquired from indigenous sources raised 2 major issues for the Jesuits and for Kamel as well. Firstly, and crucially for Catholic missionaries, there were spiritual concerns at play. Since the Filipinos had been pagans prior to the Spanish arrival, their knowledge of igasur could have come from the devil, and its powers could well be demonic. So to place the source of knowledge of the being on safe, non-indigenous foundations, the Jesuits had to dissociate it from its local context and attribute its discovery either to chance, divine origins, or to natural causes. And indeed, missionaries in Jesuit works commonly appeared to be simply using indigenous plants without having received any local help, discovering their virtues basically by accident or by divine inspiration, and subsequently testing them through experience. Basically, effacement of indigenous agency presented the safest way towards adoption. With igasur specifically, the Jesuits framed its discovery as a fortuitous accident. In his treatise, Kamel recounted a captivating story of a Jesuit priest saved by the beans when a spiteful indigene attempted to poison him. It was casuality, or literally by chance, that the priest happened to have a dried bean on him, which was the first occasion that the Spaniards learned about the virtues and powers of Igasur. Secondly, to reinvent the bean as a legitimate drug and enable its movement from its place of origin, the Jesuits had to provide it with theoretical grounding within a system of knowledge which was recognized by the Europeans. And it was through Galenization that the Jesuits sought to explain Igasur's virtues and therefore embed the drug within a framework familiar to European practitioners and customers. Based on its morphology, taste, and other qualities, Camel identified Igasur with the nux vomica of the Arabian physician Serapion, whose work had been assimilated into the Galenic corpus centuries prior. Associations between indigenous plants and canonical authors appear throughout Camel's treatises and also throughout the works of Jesuit missionaries around the globe. Now, this suggests very importantly that Camel and many of his Jesuit peers in other parts of the world looked at indigenous nature predominantly through the prism of Old World theories. Camel's investigations did not seem as strongly motivated by the hunger to discover new profitable drugs, but first and foremost by the desire to recognize plants already known to the Old World, the identities of which had been lost or remained unclear, and the markets for which had already been established. Efforts to match plants described by the ancients with their contemporary counterparts were widespread throughout the early modern period, as their true identity had been lost over the centuries, but their efficacy certified by the highest authorities. Unlike authors concerned with American nature, Camel could directly identify Philippine plants with those described by ancient authors without any intrinsic contradictions, because the regions of East Indies and its products, such as cinnamon and nutmeg, were known to ancient writers. So in the eyes of European scholarship, it was by no means impossible that a plant mentioned by classical authors should be native to lands far to the east, even as far as the Philippines. Establishing commonality between the old and the new was really the first step towards assimilation. And by associating Igasur with Serapion and presenting the plant as part of a time-proven tradition, Camel could adopt the plant into his medical practice and introduce it to his European audiences in a familiar guise. For the Jesuits, the process of Galenization was also closely associated with their spiritual crusades. By embedding indigenous plants into schemes that were both ancient and familiar to Europe, the Jesuits could construct unified human and natural histories of the world that could be traced back all the way to Noah and the Garden of Eden. So by drawing parallels between nature and people of Europe and non-European worlds, the Jesuits could write shared histories which highlighted the humanity of non-Europeans and their potential for conversion to Christianity. To galenize Igasur, Camel had to demonstrate that it shared key properties with nux vomica. Serapion himself praised nux vomica for its emetic qualities, quote, "It helps to vomit and sets humors in motion, making it easier for them to come out by vomiting." Accordingly, Camel presented several cases from his medical practice which clearly attested to the bean's emetic virtues. Based on the evidence gathered, he concluded that the bean, quote, "frequently tends to induce vomiting." He thus boasted the Galenic associations he had drawn and presented the knowledge of the bean's virtues as emerging from Jesuit trials rather than as borrowed from local healing practices. Now, Camel's experiments also revealed some undesirable side effects. He reported that most of his patients suffered from violent seizures. To give an example, "I once diluted 1 scruple of the powder of Igasur and gave it to Vicente Olcina, who was a fellow Jesuit missionary, endowed with a melancholic constitution, to provoke regurgitation, as you would with the St. Ignatius bean. He was troubled with indigestion, diarrhea, frequent nausea, sour belching, and copious flatulence. As soon as he took it, he was seized with a tremor of the whole body, which lasted for 3 hours, together with an itching and terrible convulsive twitching, so that he could not stand. It was strongest and most troublesome in his jaws, forcing him to a kind of laugh. He was having a seizure. Meanwhile, there was no notable alteration in the pulse, and there were no other subsequent symptoms. Afterwards, he felt somewhat better. Well, good for him, really. Kamel ascribed these violent effects to the differences between indigenous and European bodies. Quote, in Spaniards, Icasur almost always causes spasmodic convulsions, but not in the indigenes. This observation was in line with Galenic theory, which posited that European and indigenous humoral constitutions, reared under very different climates, would differ and therefore react to the same substances in different ways. Kamel recommended to his European leaders to use the bean with caution and in small doses. His experiments with native materia medica therefore seemed to be motivated partly by the desire to test its suitability for European humoral constitutions or for European medical clients both in Manila and beyond. In these assessments, the Jesuits used as instruments the bodies of the colonists, of the locals, and quite likely of their own. So it was through inscription into the Galenic corpus that Kamel turned a local plant into an efficient drug and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. With Icasur now being invented as a Galenic drug, it was ready to be deployed on both local and global scales. And indeed, when browsing through 18th century European works of materia medica, there is only one drug native to the Philippines that appears regularly, the St. Ignatius bean. Its supply was mediated by the Jesuits, who were involved in the early modern commerce of other drugs as well, most prominently the Jesuits' bark or cinchona. The bean seems to have been imported to Europe in relatively low quantities, perhaps as the Jesuits sought to safeguard its nature as their and exclusive goods. For instance, during the entire 18th century, the bean featured only in 17 transactions at Amsterdam public auctions, which suggests that whilst it was known to traders and apothecaries, it was not very widely available. The Jesuits did not really need to import the drug in vast amounts to make its commerce profitable. The beans could be displayed as curiosities, donated as gifts to patrons, or used as bribes to solicit favors from officials. The bean's value was rooted in its rarity and the status as a curiosity that it carried, or the faraway Philippine archipelago that it represented to the Europeans. Indeed, the bean commanded high prices and esteem in 18th century Europe. For example, in 1730, while waiting in Seville for his ship to New Spain, the German Jesuit missionary Philip Zegesser sent home to his brother, quote, 25 St. Ignatius beans, which are greatly desired both in Rome and in Vienna, and one has to consider it a blessing to get one or two. Still in 1749, the bean appeared among the most expensive items available in the drug trading hub of Lisbon. So over the course of the 18th century, the bean was increasingly finding its way into pharmacies and pharmacopoeias across Europe. Despite the proliferation of new inquiries, Kamel's treatise in the philosophical transactions remained an authoritative account throughout the 18th century. Even 50 years after its initial appearance, the German scholar Caspar Neumann wrote, quote, that the best account we have to date of this plant and of the origin of this so-called St. Ignatius bean is from Father Kamel. This longevity can be attributed to the privileged access to the source material that Kamel possessed, which enabled him to provide a detailed description and figures based on observation of the entire plant, rather than just of its commodified seeds, which would have traveled to Europe. European scholars were keenly interested in the plant's morphological features, because this information was central to 18th century classification practices. Although they generally considered the bean to be a new drug unknown to the ancients, Kamel's association with Serapions nux vomica endured, and earned the bean a clearly defined place in European traditions of materia medica, as the two were very commonly treated and classified together. So nux vomica basically provided a vehicle for the St. Ignatius bean to be introduced into the European pharmacopoeia. So it did the trick that Kamel was looking for. Now, the uses and recipes which were introduced by Kamel were also often cited and further developed. For example, the Medical Museum, published by the London Royal College of Physicians in 1764, referenced Kamel at length, but also provided more precise measurements and added antihelminthic effects to the list of the bean's virtues. Most authors warned of the drug's powerful effects and advised cautious use, drawing among other on the examples introduced by Kamel himself. As the bean was becoming integrated into the European pharmacopoeia, any mentions of indigenous knowledge and uses, which were already relatively sparse in Kamel's account, were increasingly marginalized. Whilst Jesuit missionaries had to be aware of the bean's local Filipino meanings and significance, this information had little value for European scholars. In a rather symptomatic way for European science and medicine, this lack of concern for non-European knowledge is probably the main reason why so many modern sources, including Wikipedia, wrongly credit Kamel with discovering and naming the St. Ignatius bean. Publishing a treatise in a European journal as prestigious as the Philosophical Transactions translated here into ownership and control over the drug. So to quickly conclude, the story of the St. Ignatius bean reveals that European medical traditions proved flexible enough to accommodate for medicinal plants native to the Philippines, which enabled Kamel to downplay their novelty and embed them within received European knowledge. For Kamel, classical works represented essential instruments for understanding and appropriating Philippine nature. In his work, canonical authors and their plants, such as Serapion and his nux vomica, feature essentially as dictionary categories. Stripped of their contextual meaning and stabilized through centuries of tradition, they were fixed enough to mediate across different contexts. Prior to the establishment of the Linnaean system, ancient terminology provided a stable enough language in an increasingly fragmented Europe and offered a degree of continuity amid the early modern flood of names and objects. And it was indeed through naming and assimilation into familiar schemes that European naturalists turned foreign plants into understandable entities. Through incorporation into the Galenic corpus, Kamel turned Philippine remedies into global drugs and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. However, at the heart of every attempt at appropriation lay the tricky question of commensurability. Although the St. Ignatius bean was a success story for the Jesuits, reliance on identical strategies did not guarantee the successful transplantation of all Philippine flora. In fact, the St. Ignatius bean presents the exception rather than the rule here, as it was the only drug native to the Philippines to enter the European pharmacopoeia in the 18th century. And in accordance with Galenic theory, the question of the bean's suitability for European bodies remained an obstacle to its wider circulation. As illustrated by the bean's violent effects on unaccustomed European bodies, foreign substances were always in danger of being regarded with skepticism, which Kamel sought to mitigate through the bean's recontextualization into European frameworks. Despite Kamel's efforts to efface local agencies and trajectories, it is by recovering these processes of translation that we as historians stand to gain some insights into what cross-cultural knowledge encounters entailed. Thank you very much for listening.
Seb, thank you very much. An absolutely fascinating case study that you then set into that wider context. Really great. I haven't got a direct question already in chat, so it's back to me as chair's privilege. You just ended by saying there that the Ignatius bean was the only successful transplantation by the Jesuits from the Philippines into Europe. But did they try with other examples? Were there other sort of leading contenders they thought might hit the spot?
So that's a really good question. In a way, not really. Not really. I think that the Jesuits were sort of trying to circulate these drugs on a sort of local and regional scale in the first instance. So, you know, by the sort of 1690s, we can find accounts that in Batavia, in the capital of the Dutch East Indies, the Saint Ignatius bean is already a really popular drug and taking off. It became really popular in China as well relatively quickly. So we can sort of see how the bean was circulating on an increasingly wider scale. And eventually it found its way into Europe as well. The Jesuits tried to circulate other drugs on sort of regional scale as well. And within the Philippines, there was sort of limited circulation of locally resourced remedies. But to my knowledge, none of them made it beyond the Philippine archipelago. And the question is of course why? You know, what makes the Saint Ignatius bean so special? And I'm afraid I don't really have the answer for that. Perhaps it was the violent effects, because you know the Europeans would expect their remedies to to basically produce very strong effects on their bodies, really to sort of change whatever was wrong with them, to change the humoral balance. But I genuinely don't know, and it's a question that I'm hoping to sort of explore in the future, why the Saint Ignatius bean is such a success story when there were other candidates which didn't make it, and for which the Jesuits were using very similar strategy of basically assimilating them into the Galenic framework. But I guess there's just an element of chance and an accident here.
Yeah, really interesting. And as you say, it would be interesting to look further. We've got a question in the chat from Kerry, who says, was the St. Ignatius bean classified by Linnaeus? And if so, did he just accept Camel's version of the plant?
He did not, and he did not draw extensively on Camel's account. The problem was that Camel did not very extensively describe the flower of the plant. So Camel focused much more on as a pharmacist, basically, right? He focused much more on the useful parts of the plant. So he pays a lot of attention to the roots, he pays a lot of attention to the seeds, but not as much attention to the flower. Because I think that's also in the Philippines, when you think about it, these plants probably wouldn't flower for a very long time, you know, and there were other better sort of characteristics locally to recognize the plant from its bark, from its leaves, from its seeds, rather than necessarily from its flower. Whereas the Linnaeus' classification is basically based all on flowers. So he did not draw on Camel's account to a large extent. He was definitely familiar with Camel's work. He did mention that unfortunately Camel's work is not very useful to him, because generally speaking, Camel did not pay as much attention to the flower. But he was aware of the work. There are occasional citations in Linnaeus' work, and he did consult some of Camel's specimens, which still survive in London to this day in the Sloane Herbarium in the Natural History Museum.
Thank you. No, interesting. Could I ask, if we don't have any more questions specifically for Seb, whether Mark and Kim, and I can see Nick's put his camera back on, and maybe think about any other themes we want to draw out. So Nick's actually asked you, Seb, did the bean fit at all with the doctrine of signatures?
That's a really good question, and I don't know as much about this. There are chemical interpretations of the bean sort of increase, or chemical Paracelsium sort of increasingly coming in, especially in the German-speaking lands. And I do remember looking at that. I don't have the exact answer right now. I can check if Nick is interested in that, and I'd be happy to send him more information. But I unfortunately, from the top of my head, I don't exactly remember in which way they were seeking to assimilate the bean.
Thank you. No, might be interesting to follow up. Thank you ever so much, Seb, for a fantastic Burnby Memorial Lecture, well worth waiting for. If anyone has questions for the speakers or wants to draw out any themes across all of the talks, or any queries more generally about the global nature of pharmacy history, please feel free to put them in the chat. What was striking me across all three talks was the recurrent theme of networks and networking. And I think something that we're more and more thinking about in the history of pharmacy, as in all aspects of history, when we're trying harder to tell global stories, is to think about networks and connections. And I just wondered whether you feel, any of you, that's the key to the way forward and the next stages of what you're looking into in this area. Anyone want to pick up on that?
Yes, I was just struggling to unmute myself there. I think that you put your finger, as ever, Bryony, on a really interesting question, because we've amongst many other things, been thinking about the history of Q and how best to investigate that in a more inclusive way in the future. And a theme that's come up several times is that actually the history of Q cannot only be investigated at Q. It's the international connections. So, for example, Rohan Debroy's book on malaria and cinchona is very striking. Does not use the Q archives. I raised the eyebrow when I first read it, and when I realized that the Indian archives, to which I don't have easy access, provide a really interesting, of course, connected and parallel story. So I think the Seb's talk was quite exciting in the sense that it used archives in a number of different cities, and there must have involved a certain amount of moving around to do that. And that is the future. That's a challenging one in that we're aiming to reduce our international travel, if you like. And this is obviously where digitization could have a really major role to play in allowing, but obviously one has to also have the grasp of languages, another impressive aspect of Seb's talk. The effortless roaming across Spanish, Czech, English materials, and obviously collaboration between scholars is perhaps the most obvious solution to this problem. But Kim, networks, if you're there and connected, are very much a part of your PhD thesis. Did you? Well, I mean, it's quite impressive the diversity of letters that, for example, John Eliot Howard was receiving.
I knew you'd say that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
It just looks a bit slow on this end. It's frozen. Oh God.
We can hear you, Kim.
Okay, great. All of you are frozen for me, but if you can hear me, that's fine. Yeah, it's I'm studying in my thesis. I'm looking at one particular person, John Eliot Howard, but he has got such large archives, as you would have seen yourself at the Royal Pharmaceutical Archives, Bryony, when you were there. They're really vast, and it's clear that he was collaborating with lots of people across Europe, across Britain, in India, even in South America, to be able to produce his knowledge. So it is something that I do have to look at, but I just haven't myself worked out how to work with the numbers of people he was working with at the moment. But yeah, it's clear that he, sitting in his factory laboratory, becoming the expert, I mean, like the frequently said the best expert in Britain, but never went to South America where it grew, and was writing letters constantly back and forth to people to find that knowledge instead.
Very interesting. And the other thing that occurs to me is that certainly with the Cinchona work going on with Kew as one of the hubs, you've got this historical network that you're investigating, facilitated by your contemporary network of all the researchers, which Mark just touched on. And I know, Seb, that one of our previous Burnby Bursary winners was also investigating James Pettifer, who's part of the wider network that Kamel was part of. And then we look at Nick's talk, and he's got his spreadsheet of all the connections that Mayleigh made, and therefore can take that further, you know, in a spider's web manner. And I think, you know, it's really ripe, isn't it, for more exploration, and to maybe even join the spider's webs of one person to another, and suddenly you're into, you know, the next step change of research areas. I've got a question. Oh, sorry, go on, Mark, if you've got thoughts on that. Go for it.
No, I was just going to, I think you've just noticed Stuart's put a very relevant question in the chat bar.
Yeah, no, I'll come to that now. So Stuart's asked, Seb in particular, to what extent did the Jesuit missionary network play a part in the spread of materia medica knowledge?
That's an excellent question, and I think that Mark and Kim will be able to comment on this as well. But I think that it's important to realize here that there's a geography to this in Europe. So the answer will be different in Spain and Portugal, where basically the sphere of pharmacy, especially in Portugal, is absolutely dominated by Jesuit pharmacies, and they have this global network, and they move things around between the Americas, Asia, and Europe. So there are drugs circulating constantly, and there's an excellent book by Ben Breen, which was published last year, I think, that examines this issue more extensively and focuses on the Jesuits as well. But basically, the Jesuit network played a massively important role in the circulation of materia medica around Europe. Very frequently, some of the first accounts we have of these medicinal plants that were sort of increasingly incorporated into the European pharmacopoeia come from Jesuit missionaries, or from missionaries from other religious orders as well, because they were all very extensively engaged in documenting nature of these new worlds, because you need to be aware of what's to eat, what's to avoid, what can cure you. And they were also very much aware of the commercial possibilities that these plants afforded. And the Jesuits in particular made it really one of their sort of signature things was trade in drugs. They were really extensively involved in trading drugs, in sourcing them, delivering them to Europe, and circulating them more widely. But this also goes, for example, for the introduction of American drugs in Asia. The Jesuits were also very, very active in that respect. So I think that we definitely need to look more at Jesuits in the history of the global drug trade, and not only at Cinchona and the St. Ignatius beet, but there are so many other drugs to look at and explore.
Thanks, Seb. Mark's just asked what the book was that you just recommended at the beginning of your answer. So
it's Ben Breen's The Age of Intoxication, I think that's called. Benjamin Breen, Age of Intoxication, if I remember correctly. It's an excellent book, especially if you are interested in the drug trade. Then I highly recommend.
Great, thank you. Nick's just reflected, he might want to say it out loud, but reflected that the exchange of information and trade within Jesuit circles, of course, there's an echo there with Quaker networks. So these, obviously strong religious bonds then enabling the spread of business contacts and medicine. Sorry, Nick, would you like to say any more on that?
Well, I think that was my point. I was just struck by what Seb was saying, that the Jesuits obviously exchanged information, but it was because of their religious affiliations altogether. that they would exchange information amongst themselves, particularly, and that was exactly what was happening with in the Quaker circles as well. There was a very strong exchange of information, and I'll trade with you because you're a Quaker, and you get the same thing. Well, I'll trade with you because you're a Jesuit. Yeah, so it just struck me that it was quite interesting, and of course they were both religious networks, which would have been par for the course in those days.
In commercial terms, do we think there's an added bonus, if you like, that there's a level of authenticity or trustworthiness receiving your medicines from a very avowedly religious route in that era, in the 17th, early 18th century? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I would have thought so. Yes.
Yeah, to a large extent, I would agree, because it is very much about status, about trustworthiness, and priests and missionaries are not gonna lie, right? They are. But it might also again differ based on sort of geography. I don't know whether a Protestant would trust a Jesuit missionary, right, as much as a Catholic Christian might. But yeah, it's a really great observation that these sort of networks really overlap, and it's definitely more than just the Jesuits. It's other religious communities, other religious orders as well, who are really extensively engaged in this, because
But of course the Americas and Britain, and in fact much of North Europe, the religious networks would have been Protestant ones, whereas Spain and Portugal, the religious networks, and therefore in South America and also in the Philippines, the religious networks would have been Catholic ones. Yes,
so the global geography and the underlay of empire, earlier empire, yeah, makes a big difference. I didn't know, Mark and Kim, whether you had any reflections from the Cinchona story, from the Jesuit angle. It's a bit earlier than Kim's research, but
I think in the Baines book, it had passed. The title had misled me. I hadn't realised it had a strong medicinal aspect to it, and I see it covers the sort of 17th century access to quinine, to cinchona, and so on. So I'd be really interested to see it. I think it's obvious a lot of the key literature on the Jesuit trade is sitting in Spanish, and I hope this book might be a good introduction into that route for us. But I think, I remember Stuart Anderson talking a couple of years ago now, about the medical tradition in Quakers, and I think he brought out very well in that talk that Bronnie, you will remember in the Welcome Trust building, about that notion of mutual trust being very, very important amongst Quakers.
Yeah,
absolutely. Just if you haven't spotted it, everyone in the chat, Kim's put a link to the book that Seb was recommending. Thanks, Kim. Any other questions? At the end of a 3-day conference on Zoom, I think people are feeling it slightly. Well, if no one has got anything else that springs to mind, then it just remains for me, in terms of this afternoon's session, to thank the four speakers again for some really thought-provoking talks and interesting discussion. Great pleasure to chair the session. And as it is the last session of the conference, I just wanted to finish with just a few announcements and a few thanks very briefly. Just thank you to all of the speakers across all 3 sessions. Thank you to the Pharmaceutical Society Museum and the Thackeray Museum for their special films which they've provided on our YouTube channel. They are still there and will be till at least the end of June, actually, if you haven't yet had a chance to take a look. As conference organiser, I wanted to thank all of the BSHP committee members for their help. This is obviously a new adventure for us, but one we're pleased with, and particularly wanted to thank Roy, Selina, and the techie team, Chris, Mark and Matthew, for helping us to make it happen. To end really by saying that at this point in our in-person conference, we normally announce where we're going to be next year. And for the last 2 years, so last year and this year, we were supposed to be in Salford in Manchester. And those of you that are members will know that that is our plan for next year, to hold an in-person conference, the equivalent weekend in Manchester. But we are very aware of the reach that we're gaining virtually, and we will obviously be considering how we can make that available. But before then, we've got 3 more online talks planned for the next 3 months, if you would like to join us on Zoom. And just to plug the next one, which is on April the 26th, when Christiana Steiger is going to be talking from Apollo to the ISS, the history of space pharmacy, which we're all really looking forward to. You'll receive a follow-up email as a result of being at this conference with a link to the Eventbrite registration for that event, and also with details of BSHP's website, how to join us, and how to find our information about bursaries, our programme, and all our other activities. So I think that brings us to a close. Thank you finally all for joining us. It's not much of a conference without an audience. It's been lovely to see familiar and new faces, and we look forward to seeing you either on Zoom in April or in person, either in London or perhaps in Manchester next year. So thanks very much. And I don't need to wish you a safe journey home. Enjoy your G&T this evening. Thank you.